and it's a slippery slope. And we don't like slippery slopes. Unless we are sliding down a slope, then it's nice if it's slippery. Otherwise, it's gonna burn your bum. Ciao, I'm Mario, a Swiss car guy on YouTube, and today I'm driving around in the rain in my 2008 Lexus LS600H. And the topic for today's video came to my mind after I had watched one of number 27's videos, where he discussed that, you know, in the future classic cars will be worth less, most likely, because you will not be allowed to drive them anywhere because of low emission zones in city centers and stuff like that. And he asked to comment what it's like in other places, because he's from the UK. So I commented that, you know, in Switzerland we actually don't have these low emission zones where some cars are forbidden. And he responded in the comments that he was actually amazed that Switzerland didn't have such a thing. And that actually prompted me to do this video, because I think Switzerland is being perceived as being this green and car hating country. I mean, it is to some point, but I don't think it's as bad as other countries in Europe. I think this whole preconceived notion comes from the fact that Switzerland was one of the first countries in Europe to mandate catalytic converters. In fact, in Switzerland, catalytic converters were mandatory on new cars starting from 1986. Which, fun fact, Switzerland at that time adopted pretty much exactly the Californian emission rules. So every new car sold starting from 1986 in Switzerland needed to have a catalytic converter. And at that time in Europe, that was still quite advanced. I think Germany only switched over to catalytic converters in 1989. So there's this image of Switzerland being this, you know, progressive country, very ecologically minded, but after that, Switzerland did nothing, because then the European Community, or later the European Union, they started making their own emissions rules. And Switzerland basically just adhered to them and didn't do anything else. In fact, I think Switzerland might be even more lax as to environmentalism for cars. And yes, in Switzerland we have emissions controls on cars, meaning a periodical checkup you have to do, but only for some cars. Because you see, if your car is modern enough, it has onboard diagnosis system, it has an emission standard that is Euro 3 or higher for gas engines, or it has Euro 4 or higher for diesel engines, you don't even have a periodical emissions checkup that you have to do. Otherwise, for a car with a catalytic converter, you have to have the emissions inspection every 2 years. And that's not the same thing as the MOT, the roadworthiness inspection. And you don't do them together, because the emissions control you do at a local garage or at a dealership, and the roadworthiness control you basically do at the DMV. So if you have an old car, you have to have emissions check every 2 years. With a new car, you don't, because it has an advanced onboard diagnostic system that is recognized by Switzerland. So that means that if you have a modern car, as soon as your check engine lamp lights up, which usually has something to do with emissions control, you have to fix it right away. Because if the police were to catch you in a regular stop, they can fine you. And also, if you're at your periodical inspection with the check engine light on, the car will not pass the inspection. So you need to get it fixed every 2 years anyway. Of course, not every old car has to do the periodic emissions test, because there's a cutoff. So every car that has been first sold, or let's say registered, before January 1st, 1976 is exempt from an emissions checkup. Since there was no periodical emissions inspection when those cars were sold, so before January 1976, the cars remain exempt to this day. So you have actually only, well, let's say a relatively small windows of cars broadly sold between 1976 and the early 2000s for gas engines, and the mid to late 2000s for diesel engines. Those are actually the only cars that have to do a periodical emissions inspection. And for the newer cars, they have abolished it because it was completely stupid. You have a computer in the car that at any time can tell you exactly how many emissions the car is producing, and the whole engine is geared towards that, and the control units work with those information. So why do you have to pay a garage to stick a probe into your exhaust? It makes no sense. So they abolished that, which is good. So actually another thing that makes car ownership a bit easier in Switzerland, unless you have a car, sold between 1976 and 2000 or something like that. But if you have something a bit newer, a bit more modern, you don't have to do the stupid emissions checkup, which is already a good thing. But then again, how did we get to that image of car-hating Switzerland? And I think there are a few factors that play into it. I mean, if you look at the roads in Switzerland, they are generally not that bad, but they are not really adequate for the amount of traffic we have nowadays. Because in Swiss politics, there is this notion that we have to reduce traffic. And they think that a good way to reduce traffic is to not build roads, to not build infrastructure. So if people know, well, there isn't any roads, then they will not drive there. But as you can see, I'm now driving through Zurich, and I have to drive through Zurich because I live south of Zurich, and now I have to go somewhere east of Zurich. And there's two ways to go there. The one thing is to take the ring road around the west and the north of Zurich, which is about 20 kilometers longer than driving through Zurich, which I don't particularly like because you drive more kilometers, so it's not necessarily more ecological. And the other thing that I really don't like about ring roads is that those ring roads, they also connect, the east to the west, and so they are usually, you have a lot of traffic there, and as soon as something happens, if you have an accident there, then you're stuck. Then it takes hours for you to get through. And instead I drive through the city because I think it's at least just as fast, if not faster. And if there is traffic, you have ways, around it to take an alternative route, which there isn't on a motorway where you're trapped there, where you cannot get out. So this is why I have to drive through Zurich, because we don't have the infrastructure to drive around the west. There was a project, I think it was in the 80s, to build a bridge over Zurich. And that, funny enough, would be right here in Wiedikon, where I'm now, because this is where the motorway ends. So if you drive onto Zurich from the motorways from the south, you will end up here. The motorway just ends in the city, which kind of doesn't make sense. If you have a motorway that ends in a city, what happens to the cars coming from behind? I mean, there has to be traffic and traffic jams, because on a motorway you drive like 100 kph. In the city you drive 50 if you manage to do that. But this is actually just a remainder of that, because originally there was supposed to be an exit that would bring you to the bridge over the city. That bridge was never built, so we just have this stub of motorway that ends in the city, which makes no sense. Oh, there was, or maybe there still is, it's been recurring over the years, the project of building a tunnel under the city. But that would be very expensive, and so they never built it. So I'm still stuck driving through town. But it's not just Zurich. It's basically everywhere. New roads don't really get built in Switzerland because the politicians still think, and the people as well, that roads bring traffic. But I would argue that, the traffic is there anyway. With good roads, you can manage it, you can drive it around the towns and keep, the inner cities a bit cleaner, a bit less polluted. But that's just not going to happen in Switzerland, I think. And this is something I've arranged myself with. And it's also one of the reasons why I like driving my Lexus so much. Because, despite it being large, it's actually a pretty good city car, with its hybrid system and, being very smooth, being very good at stop-start. This is kind of the car you need if you drive a lot through congested areas, because at least it's comfortable, at least it's smooth, it's quiet, it's a nice place to be. Whereas when I drive my GTR, and that's the reason why I don't drive my GTR that much, it's not really fun on these roads. It's not really fun standing in traffic with it, and the Lexus is perfectly fine. Instead of building roads, Switzerland is more focused on, extending public transport and building that up, which works to a point. Because, here in Zurich, yes, of course, the more public transport, the better, because you have a kind of a large accumulation of people in one place. But as soon as you're in more rural areas, it doesn't really work, because the public transport is not as frequent, you don't get to as close as where you need to go, so having a car there makes a bit more sense. And even in my case here, where I'm again going to visit my mom, with the car, even with the traffic we have today, it's going to be about 1 hour and 20 minutes. With public transport, it's about 3 hours and a couple of minutes. So there's not really an alternative. And the other point is, there's a lot of transfers going on. So money from taxes, from car taxes, from fuel taxes, that is used to subsidize the public transport. And it's kind of schizophrenic, because the politicians want to get people out of cars and into public transport. But the problem is, if we all get onto public transport, first off, we don't have close to enough public transport. And second, who pays for public transport? Because then if people don't pay for fuel, people don't drive around and register their cars, where's the money going to come from? I mentioned in the beginning of the video that I had responded to number 27's video by saying that Switzerland didn't have any, low emission zones. But that wasn't exactly true, because Switzerland does have one city that declared its city center or parts of it to be a low emission zone that you can only access with a particularly low emissions car. They have made such a sticker system that you have to put on the cars. They copied the system they use in France. And that city, of course, is the city of Geneva. But the thing is, why I don't regard it as being a true low emission zone, it's because while they have introduced it, it's still being disputed in court, and therefore they do not fine you. So they have this low emission zone that you can only access with a low emission car, but if you don't, there's no consequences. So they don't have a low emission zone. And Switzerland, being that direct democracy that it is, everything and every law that gets passed can be challenged in a referendum, in lawsuits, in whatever, and it's going to happen, especially something that's as radical as a low emission zone, which means barring some cars from driving in cities, because that could be construed as being unfair, because that means, okay, if you are rich and you have, a Tesla or one expensive new low emission car, you can drive in Geneva to your heart's content. But if you are like poor, or you're a working class family where you cannot afford a vehicle that's new, that's low emission, you cannot drive there anymore. So you could argue that that is against some constitutional principles like equality. Therefore, it's right to be challenged. And personally, I hope it gets challenged. I hope it gets repealed. And I'm particularly also critical of that, and I hope that they do not get through with this, because otherwise other cities in Switzerland will take them as an example and start doing the same thing. But basically from, an emissions aspect, Switzerland is not really class leading in Europe. We just follow the European Union. So whatever standards they decide on, we just adapt them. If you've ever been to Switzerland, you'll pretty quickly realize that Switzerland cannot really be that car hating, because the cars driving around tend to be pretty nice. Switzerland is one of those countries where people will usually buy the high-end models of whatever it is. So if you see a Golf round here, by example, most often it will be a GTI or a Golf R, because people they have the money, so they tend to buy the top end. And also, if it wasn't raining today, but if it was a nice day, driving through Zurich, we would easily see a few Ferraris, Lamborghinis, some nice car. Today I've just seen a few Porsches and Aston Martins, but not every day can be a sunny day. But people have a lot of money and they like to spend it on cars. I mean, I'm preparing a video now where I looked at sales figures of different cars. And yes, I'm working on the review of the Toyota Supra. And when I looked up the numbers, the sales numbers, because I figured the car would be, a kind of very exotic car because they wouldn't sell a lot, I realized that in the same time since the Supra was launched, Ferrari sold twice as many 812 Superfasts here in Switzerland. So people have money and they like to spend it on cars. The thing is, and what amazes most people is, okay, you got all these nice high power cars. I mean, there's an RS6 right there in front of me. It's where do you drive them? Because as we know, speed limits in Switzerland are quite strict. They are also quite low. And, speeding is not necessarily something you want to do in this country. And this is the other crux, because there are no racetracks in Switzerland, which is kind of weird if you think what kind of cars drive around here. How many people own very high powered, very, very sporty cars, and yet we have nowhere to drive them. Because you can risk driving them on the roads, but it's playing with fire at this point. And yes, of course, we can go abroad to go to a racetrack there. We just cannot do it now because of some stupid pandemic going on. And this also really brings it home. Usually it's, I don't care, let's go to Germany, let's go to Italy, let's put the car on the track there. But now where, you cannot really travel, we don't have racetracks. And the reason why Switzerland doesn't have any racetracks is because motor racing is forbidden in Switzerland. Of course it is, because everything that's fun is forbidden in this country. And the reason for this, believe it or not, but it goes back to the 1955 Le Mans incident, where a Mercedes Silver Arrow basically lost control and crashed into the public and killing over 80 people back there. And that accident was huge. It had huge consequences. It was the reason why Mercedes-Benz back then retired from racing, because they thought it was too dangerous, and having killed so many people, they most likely also felt a bit guilty. But most countries actually, right after that accident, they temporarily banned all forms of motorsports over safety concerns. The difference between Switzerland and other countries is that other countries within a few weeks or months re-allowed motor racing, and Switzerland since 1955 hasn't. So we are still banning motorsports because of an accident that happened 66 years ago. There were discussions about allowing it back, but a majority of Swiss people, they don't care. They don't care about cars, and they certainly don't care about racing. There were even projects with, a Swiss Grand Prix, a racetrack, even a whole business case around it. But the Swiss people were just, nah, not interested. There is, I think, an exception for electric racing, which I personally do not get, because how is racing an electric car any more safe than racing a internal combustion car? It doesn't make any sense, because in fact in Zurich a few years ago there was a Formula E Grand Prix or E-Prix or however they called it, which was very bizarre to have these electric racers race through the city center of Zurich behind just a little bit of scaffolding. How is that safe compared to having a proper racetrack with, empty zones and everything? So it's not really a safety argument. It's more like, we forbade it back then and that's that. So in Switzerland, we don't even have racetracks. So there's nowhere we can drive our high-powered sports cars except for the road, where you get ticketed for everything you do and you lose your license if you do a bit more. So from that aspect, yes, Switzerland hates cars, not really for ecological reasons, but just because they are cars, I figure. I know this place might look like, wow, they're building roads, they are really working on it. What you said is just wrong. But the thing is, yes, they are sort of building roads, but only because there's going to be a huge real estate project over here. And when there's real estate involved, then there's money, and then they do everything. But if it's just roads as an infrastructure, forget it. Interestingly enough, even fuel isn't that expensive in Switzerland. I mean, it is expensive right now because of reasons. I reckon it has to do with the pandemic and shortages and stuff like that, because last time I fueled up, I paid, I think, 1 franc and 84 cents per liter, which is quite a lot. I mean, I track all the data, so I can show you what it costs usually. But you know, fuel costs in Switzerland are pretty much aligned with the rest of Europe, except for diesel. Diesel is more expensive than in the European Union because the European Union subsidizes diesel, which Switzerland doesn't, quite rightly so. I originally set out to do a video showing that Switzerland actually isn't as car-hating and green as many people from abroad tend to believe, but now, after having talked for a couple of minutes about the topic, I realized that maybe Switzerland is quite car-hating. I mean, the Swiss people still, they love their cars, and you see it by the cars driving around. A lot of money is being spent on cars. But, you know, the government doesn't really want you to enjoy your car, and they are doing their best to make it even worse in the future. So maybe, yes, Switzerland is a car-hating country, and it may be a living hell for car owners. But then again, I still like living here, and when I want to drive my car the way it was supposed to be driven, I have to go abroad. Well, at least Switzerland is small. You're quickly in Germany, you're quickly in France, you're quickly in Italy, you're quickly in Austria. But then again, this is all we have. So how is it in your country? How are the emissions rules? And, well, I guess you can have motorsports there because you're not Switzerland. But let me know in the comments down below what it's like for you and what a living hell living in Switzerland must be. If you like this video, please leave a like. And if you want to see more videos in the future, consider subscribing to the channel for reasons that only you know why you would want to do that. But maybe you just like the sound of my voice, which is something I personally can't say I do, but hey, you do you. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching and have a nice day. The tunnel! It's a tunnel, but it's a short one. I'm about to get out of it. It's only a matter of seconds. And now I'm out of the tunnel.